Hello and welcome. Today's exciting episode is a little bit different. I often get asked about the history of Chanel and also the structural layer of jackets and why I use net, and also about quilting the silk to the inside of the tweed as opposed to having an actual structural layer on the jacket. So instead of doing separate episodes on all those things, I've combined them together in sort of a podcast, but I've also put photos of Chanel jackets and tweeds and Chanel all together. And yeah, so if you busy wrapping presents, you can listen, but also if you want to watch, there's some really gorgeous footage. There's footage of my jackets, but also photos and images of those things, and Lesage tweed in particular. Oh, so beautiful. Anyway, hope you enjoy.
It's perfect. Perfect jacket.
Once upon a time, there was a planet named Earth and a girl named Chanel. Her parents were very poor, and she had 5 brothers and sisters. One passed away when he was only 6 months of age, but big family, very poor. You get it. Gabrielle Chanel's father was a travelling salesman, and her mum was mostly unwell. The kids didn't go to school. They were just too poor. And when she was 11, depending on your reference, their mother passed away. So if you think that sounds a bit wrong, she did often retell her childhood in a very different way. She said her father was this romantic entrepreneur who sailed on his sailboat to America to make his fortune, and her mother died in childbirth. Not the case. So at first, little Gabrielle Chanel was thrilled when her mother died, because she was like, oh, my dad, the travelling salesman, he's going to come home and he's going to save me. Her charming, dashing father would finally be there to look after her, and she'd have all his love and attention all the time. Well, that was the dream. The reality was that he came home just long enough to take the kids to the orphanage and sign them over to the nuns. It seemed like Gabrielle spent the rest of her childhood dreaming of his return, but none of the others wore such rose-coloured glasses about their father. They sort of just carried on. The orphans and abandoned children had to learn skills, to earn their keep when they lived with the nuns, while the rich children had proper lessons from the nuns. So, Gabrielle and her sister were forced to learn how to sew. Well, her sister learned how to sew properly. Gabrielle, not so much. She just spent her time staring at the rich kids getting their proper education. She mostly dreamed of her father coming back to rescue her, and she nursed her grudges. She wanted to be one of the rich kids. So that went on for years. That was basically her childhood. And then at 18, the nuns can't keep people in the orphanage until after 18, so they had to fend for themselves. They sort of basically got kicked out, and she and her sister went and lived at a boarding house for good Catholic girls or young women, and they had to get a job as a seamstress during the day, long grueling hours. But Chanel still dreamed of a much more glamorous life. So as well as working full time, she dragged her sister along too, also worked as waitresses at a popular cafe. Now, French cafes are more like a tavern, they're rowdy, there's alcohol, and the stage, the musician played, and between sets, if you were one of the more ambitious waitresses, you could sing a popular song, and if the locals liked you, then you could graduate to becoming a paid musician. And Gabrielle Chanel was still really determined to be rich and famous. Sadly, she was also tone deaf, and how she got the nickname Rooster, or Coco in French, was she was just so bad at singing, but she didn't care. She kept singing, and she also kept the name Coco. She was so into nursing her grudges, you cannot believe. And this actually helped her when she started her own business. She felt her grudges helped her when no one else would. And that was kind of her rationale. You don't have to agree with her, but it did definitely form who she was. And eventually she did what all very poor young women do at the time. She became a mistress to a very rich man. At first she thought that was it. She'd won the prize. She was out of poverty for good. But it soon became evident to her that this wasn't the case. His rich aristocratic friends would rarely even acknowledge her existence, even when they were in the same room. Well, especially when they were in the same room. Again, Chanel took it on the chin. She was like, oh, I don't care. I'm sleeping in this really gorgeous house and eating all this really lovely food, and I don't have to work 12 hours a day in a factory to have all this. But on the other hand, his rich friends were really openly hostile towards her. They told her all the things she wasn't. And yeah, again, Chanel being Chanel, she used this to nurse her grudge. She told herself that when she was rich and famous, they would be begging to fawn all over her. But Chanel was also really practical. She thought to herself, well, they're right. Mistresses do come and go. She knew that this gig would end eventually and she'd have to get another rich guy, then another rich guy. That was considered a job in France, arguably, might still be, unless she could come up with a better plan. So women didn't really have their own businesses at the time, but that was her ambition. And she made a list of things that all the rich friends were always ridiculing her about. So Coco can't ride, Coco never went to school, Coco hasn't read any literature, she's not cultured, she's not fat and well nourished like those who grew up with wealth. So yeah, back then this was still, poverty and skinniness were very much synonymous. Spoiler alert, Gabrielle was the one who changed that. So yeah, when his rich friends wouldn't talk to her, she shrugged her shoulders and headed down to the stables, and she learnt how to ride. She became an expert horsewoman. She also read her way through his entire library. Oh, and the stable hands, the men and the boys who worked in the stables, they had this fabulous uniform. The jacket was, well, we would call it a sports jacket with a family crest embroidered on the pocket. Yeah, that becomes the iconic Chanel jacket. Like many kept women, Gabrielle complained that she had nothing to do for those long periods when he had to go off and conduct official family business because she was like the piece on the side. So like most men, he lent her some money, like lent in, air quotes, some money to start her own hobby shop or small business. This was really, really common. Now, when most women mistresses got their seed money to start their, play business of their very own, they'd had no financial training or no business training. So typically they just made a few really bad investments really quickly and they lost all the money. But not Chanel. She was scrappy as hell and very determined. She was always honest with herself about her shortcomings. While she had pretty much already set her sights on becoming a rich, famous and very influential designer in Paris, she also knew she didn't have the sewing or drafting skills for clothing or the capital required. She was going to start small and build. So she looked around for a bargain and she found one. There was a bulk shipment of straw hats going really cheap. So she snapped them up. She also bought lots of ribbons and she tied them onto it and added a hefty price tag, and she pitched them as the must-have of the season. It was bold and brash, but it totally paid off. She was in business and she was never going to have to rely on charming any man ever again. As soon as possible, she paid back the seed money. He, of course, tried to refuse it because rich men simply did not take money from their kept woman. It was like so not done. And but she was adamant. She paid him back in full. She was now independent and the business was all hers. No one could take it away from her. For a while she did just stick to hats, but then she finally did branch out into clothing. She knew she couldn't compete with the society designers creating extremely expensive gowns for corseted old money women. So she decided to do the exact opposite. The rich young things were rebelling against this old way and these old styles. They were bold, they were slim, and they were athletic, and they had money to burn. So Chanel decided she was going to make athletic clothes, expensive, exclusive athletic clothes, and the super rich would come begging to wear them. Well, they didn't exactly come begging to begin with, so she had to pay a few of her rich, famous actress friends to wear her brand, and that soon did the trick. Thin, poor Gabrielle Chanel was soon making clothes for the super rich. And those clothes looked a lot like the jackets the staff in their stables, horse stables, wore, except Chanel jackets obviously cost a lot more. So the first Chanel jackets were made from jersey because, again, there was a bulk shipment of jersey that Chanel could get for an absolute steal. Back then, jersey was only really used for underwear, but Chanel knew her audience. The rich young things loved to be risque. They loved the idea of a non-corseted outfit, a comfortable modern suit made from a fabric guaranteed to annoy the hell out of their staid, old-moneyed families. But obviously, they weren't the best-made jackets. They were made without structure from a cheap fabric, not intended for use in outerwear. Of course, the jacket stretched and fell apart. Also, you can't wear a thin fabric in winter. Chanel needed to make newer, better jackets. By this point, Chanel was having an affair with a rich, titled English guy named Boy Chappelle, and English menswear was incredibly fashionable even in France, with the new set at this time. Chanel knew she had to use British wool for her Chanel jackets. That would make them sell. Like most of the English landed gentry at the time, Boy Chappelle got his wools and his tweeds from Linton Tweeds, and so would Chanel. So, to recap, Chanel is now a designer. She's building her name, she's building her brand, building her empire, building her fame, and she's invented/appropriated and rebranded the iconic Chanel jacket. First, it was very temporary, very problematic, but super fashionable jersey, and now it's in tweed. She spent her childhood being scolded for not knowing how to sew in sewing class from the nuns. Now she had her own designer clothing brand, and she was financially independent. And most of all, she was in love, real love for the first time, and he also loved her. I mean, asterisk, he had to marry someone else. But you get the picture. She had genuine success by her standards for the first time in her life. Okay, we will leave Chanel's life here for now. I know many of you have comments and questions about Chanel and World War II. I'll do a separate video on that. For now, we are going to focus just on the Chanel jacket. Let's look at how it was designed, constructed, and made. Chanel was the ideas person. She took care of the big picture. Her skills in designing, drafting, and sewing did improve over the years, but mostly she was concerned with concepts, commercial viability, brand building, and costs. That was what she was good at. These first tweed jackets had a full tweed outer jacket, a full silk lining, and no structural layer or structural elements at all. Not surprisingly, the tweed jackets began sagging almost immediately and the seams pulled. Clients were demanding their money back, but Chanel was a brilliant businesswoman. Plus, she had grown up in absolute poverty and was still nursing a very big grudge about that. She was not going to give one single rich client any of their money back, not ever, not once. But at this point, it was a crisis. She'd spent too long laughing at their complaints and ignoring the problem. She had to do something big and do it immediately. So Gabrielle did what Gabrielle did best. She looked at her own weaknesses and all of the strengths and came up with an imperfect but cost-effective solution. The tweed jackets made by English tailors would take weeks to make. There was dozens upon dozens of hours of hand stitching just in the structural layer of each jacket. Chanel couldn't afford to pay her staff to do all that. And she would also have to be present for those never-ending fittings. No, definitely not. She didn't have a problem with the current way the jackets were made. She didn't have any problems at all. She just needed some kind of band-aid. She was happy with everything. She just needed a tack on at the end. And so, yeah, a proper dressmaker would have never come up with this solution. But as I said, Chanel was an ideas person. So she decided that her seamstresses would make the jackets the way they've always made them. And then at the end, they'd just sew the tweed and the silk together. And, that would delay any falling apart or sagging, and it would basically solve the problem from her perspective. Obviously, didn't really solve it. But she was happy with it. She was like, okay, mock up one of those. And then she looked at it and she's like, done, problem solved. Now, if you know anything about garment construction, you will know that this quote unquote solution really just put more pressure on the jacket seams. It only slowed the sagging process, and it also sped up the aging process of the lining. Lining is supposed to be detachable so that you can take it out every decade or two and replace it with new silk, thus lengthening the overall life of this very expensive tweed jacket. That's how bespoke tailored jackets work. By sewing the lining to the tweed, this virtually became impossible. I think the heads of her sewing studio must have been pulling their hair out in frustration, thinking the solution would never work. But what Chanel didn't know about dressmaking or tailoring, she made up for in business savvy. Her clients were exclusively the young mega rich. They were never going to wear their investment pieces for the rest of their lives. They didn't care if it lasted decades. It had to last the 6 months they thought it was in fashion. And if it lasted that, then she wouldn't get any more complaints. And so, yeah, the Band-Aid is still the standard. So many dressmakers still stitch the silk to the tweed by the request of their clients because it's what a vintage Chanel jacket looks like. To this day, the classic Chanel jacket, has remained pretty much the same. The two centre front panels in a lining layer were sometimes still silk, but it became more common for them to be made out of tweed. Again, this was for practicality and cost. The buttonholes last longer without damage if the inside front panels are tweed, not silk. And also, those panels sort of rub, and if you're wearing jeans or anything like that, the silk tears, whereas if they're made of tweed, they don't. I'll do a separate video on all the other elements of the classic Chanel jacket, but basically the more buttonholes, the more she could charge for dressmaking labour and the cost of those custom-made gold buttons, so hence all the buttonholes. Pockets, the more pockets on a garment, the more material it takes and the more time it takes to make, and therefore she could charge her clients more. Also, traditionally, the super rich in Europe were known as the people too rich for pockets. They didn't need them, like they didn't carry small change. They had people for that, and they didn't carry their things. They had people for that. So yeah, I feel like the spiteful grudge-holding side of Chanel was delighted to make her super rich clients both pay for and wear four pockets on almost every single Chanel jacket she made. When the French press started asking her about, why she's making pockets on clothes for rich people who really do not need pockets, she came up with this story that she started, that it was about the rich boarding girls in the nuns, where she grew up, and she just dreamed of being one of those rich kids who got to go to school. But and in photos she started wearing jackets with pockets as well. But yeah, I think it's the grudge holding side of Chanel that put 4 pockets on every jacket she sold to a rich person. Anyway, back to the structural layers of Chanel jackets. Let's fast forward to present day. We now have 2 types of designer clothing. There are the ready-to-wear lines, which is the designer house equivalent of fast fashion. There is a set range of sizes, and the dressmakers at Chanel have to make a certain number of each of the jackets, and then they're shipped off to all the different Chanel boutiques around the globe. That is ready to wear. You take it off the hanger, you try it on. If it fits, sort of, and you can afford it, then you can buy it. Since the pandemic, Chanel has really scaled back its ready to wear. I think there are just so many designer knockoffs. I mean, the big design houses still all have ready-to-wear collections, but they don't make it to the store so much because there's a 6-month lag between showing the collection and it appearing in a store, because obviously they need to be made in the Paris ateliers. But by the time they've come out in the boutiques, all the knockoff fashions are already being sold, they're being worn, and they're kind of out of date already. I think they used to make money out of their ready-to-wear clothing in the design houses, used to actually make money out of it. Now they just make money out of perfume, sunglasses, and jewellery. So, and handbags, obviously. They make most of their money on handbags. But they do still make a few jackets. But the ready-to-wear jackets, they still don't have a structural layer. And they used to use silk chamois, the silk that got sewn to the tweed layer, but they changed from heavy, luxurious, shiny silk chamois that they use in the vintage Chanel jacket linings. That's quite expensive. Nowadays they use a more lightweight silk, and also they don't custom print a different design for each different type of jacket. They just usually have one Chanel silk design per collection, and it's silk crepe. That cheap and lighter silk can't be machine sewn to the tweed. It's not robust enough to carry the weight of tweed or put up with all that machine sewing. So yeah, I guess they get to cut out the cost of forcing the dressmakers to do all that machine sewing. Plus, they're using, crepe silk is slightly cheaper than silk chamois, and designing one design for the silk rather than one for each individual type of jacket, which amounts to dozens of different designs for each different silk. That's cheaper as well. So, yeah, that's how a ready-to-wear Chanel jacket is made these days. Oh, and they aren't made with Linton tweeds anymore either. Under Karl Lagerfeld, the popularity of the iconic Chanel jacket kept growing, so Chanel needed more tweeds from several sources, which meant they sort of got them from all over France and Europe. And a short while before breakfast, Chanel actually stopped buying tweeds outside Europe altogether, which means no more tweeds from Linton. But they are historically accurate, and they do still make really reasonably priced and very high quality tweeds. I'm not sponsored by anyone, but I do always get asked. So if you're looking for reasonably priced tweeds that are really good quality, Mood Fabrics carries some in New York City, and also Linton Tweed in the UK. Both have online stores, both ship all over the globe. And yeah, again, not sponsored. I just use them and they have worked for me, and my jackets are a decade and a half old and still going strong. So now let's talk about the haute couture Chanel jackets, or the bespoke ones that are made to measure. The haute couture jackets are gorgeous. when Lagerfeld reigned, they used to be even more gorgeous and extravagant, but they're still pretty fabulous for several reasons. So Karl Lagerfeld, well, he has many faults and failures as a human being, don't get me wrong, but he did see that the only way to save many of the historic fashion artisan houses in Paris would be for Chanel, or more correctly, the rich family who own Chanel. Karl just bullied them into buying all this living French history, and yeah, it meant that the people, the flower makers, the ones who do the feathers, the ones who custom make the gold buttons or do the beading and embroidery, all those fashion houses, they kept their names, but they're now owned by the family who owns Chanel. How this impacted the Chanel couture collections is that, well, you probably noticed they're always incredibly bling. They've got loads of feathers, loads of camellias that are handmade. They've got acres of beading and embroidery. The buttons are so amazing and so unique because the Chanel collection, for the creative director of Chanel, whoever they are, has to buy a certain amount, has to place orders of a certain amount at the button place, at the feather place, at the flower place, and at Lesage. So let's get on to Lesage. Now, mostly the Lesage workshop is known for their exquisite embellishment for Balmain, Chanel and Christian Dior. It's just magnificent. But Lesage also make tweed, very expensive, very unique tweeds. They are my God, chef's kiss. They are the best. And the creative director of Chanel has to order a certain amount of, like a certain number of yards, and they have to use the Lesage tweeds in every collection. And the way it's how Lesage Tweeds remains financially viable as a business, because it is just so creative and artistic. You wonder how they make ends meet. They're just so good at what they do, but what they do is, prohibitively expensive experimental tweeds. And the problem with prohibitively expensive experimental tweeds is that they're very delicate. Tweed jackets made out of these sort of tweeds have to have a structural layer, or they would just fall apart when you cut them and sew them. So haute couture Chanel jackets do have a structural layer. Now, if you know anything about bespoke jackets, normally they use English style tailoring, which means the structural layer is made with natural fibers. Like horsehair is a rough cotton fabric with bits of horsehair, long horsetail glued to the cotton canvas to make it stiffer. And that is the traditional way, like a men's suit. If you pulled it apart and looked at the inside, that is what it's made out of. And so that's the English style tailoring. But Parisian design houses, they're sort of a bit, always a bit English versus French. But also, it's hard to explain, but creatives in Europe, particularly in Paris, aren't snobbish about fashion. They love and embrace it. So fashion designers like Coco Chanel would mix with composers, would mix with ballet dancers, with people who choreograph the ballet, and they fashion designers, and painters and writers often design sets and costumes for the ballets and the operas. And it was all one big cultural melting pot of intellects and creatives. So, where you buy a English style bespoke jacket, it will have horsehair. But if you buy a French or Parisian one, it will most often be influenced heavily by the costumes, how costumes are made for opera and ballet. So we'll rewind a bit. Originally, designer gowns were made at a time when women wore corsets every day. But then last century, designer gowns had to change with the times. Women wanted to appear chic and modern, so they no longer wanted a separate corset. But they still wanted that look of the cinched-in waist, the fabulousness of the corset. So vintage designer gowns have built-in corsets, like an invisible structural layer. The jackets of men's suits have the same thing, but with men's suits, they use horsehair for stiffness, which is very heavy and very itchy. In the vintage Dior gowns, they use stiff netting, which is taken from the opera costumes and the ballet ones. They still need the structure because those stage costumes have to dazzle and be seen and be beautiful from, right at the back of the stalls. They have to have massive visual impact, which means they have to use massive gems stitched onto them. So they have to be incredibly structurally sound. So the opera and the ballet costumes used stiff netting, which wasn't as heavy as the horsehair, which was heavy cotton with horsehair glued to it, and also does not mix well with sweat. So it was decided that for women's design wear, they would use the stiff netting, which is basically a synthetic horsehair. And that is why we have Dior and Chanel jackets with a structural layer that is made from stiff netting rather than the more Englishly correct horsehair canvas. Now, I've probably told you at the start of the intro of this video where you can buy net, but I'll tell you again. So netting or stiff netting, it looks like tulle, but it's a much stiffer, more robust version. Tulle is the floaty stuff that you make a bridal veil out of, and it comes in nylon, cotton, silk. It's not that. That has no structural integrity. It's gorgeous and has many uses, but it won't give you the structural integrity you require. Net or stiff netting can be found at the costume, cosplay or dance section of your big box store, the biggest, cheapest fabric store that in your area. Go there, go to the darkest corner where they keep the plastic, because plastic degrades in natural sunlight. So yeah, find the darkest corner where if your town is known for its dance, then it'll be called dance. If your town has a cosplay thing every few months, then it'll be called the cosplay section. Whatever it is, just the novelty fabrics, and it's called net or stiff netting. Tell the shop assistants that you're looking for the kind of fabric that you make 1950s petticoats out of, and they'll know the stiff net that you're talking about. You're looking for the nylon one. So it's basically a thin, stiff, hard layer of plastic. And when you cut it, if you cut it with sharp scissors, the edges will be very sharp, and you'll get cuts all over your arms like you've got a new scratchy kitten. But if you use your dullest scissors, then you will, it's still quite easy to cut, but it will just mean that the edges are that little bit duller and you won't get endless paper cuts. So that is my tip. Oh, and in America, there is something called synthetic horsehair canvas, horsehair canvas, but it's only as wide as a ribbon. When you buy net or stiff netting, it is a full 60 inches wide or 147 centimeters wide. So it's as wide as fashion fabric, and that is the stuff that you need, because you're basically, if you're buying 2 yards of tweed for your jacket, you also need to buy 2 yards of the backing fabric. Well, I do heavy beading on mine, so I buy twice as much stiff netting because I need 2 layers of net for every 1 piece of tweed. But yeah, you need the actual fabric stuff, not just thin as a ribbon. That's not going to help you. The thin as a ribbon horsehair stuff is so that you sort of sew it to the bottom of the hem of a circle skirt, and it makes it sort of sit out better. It's really good for that, but it's not going to be good to make a structural layer out of your garment. I have been asked if you can just use, if you don't want your jacket to look boxy and really formal, can you just use pre-wash some cotton and use that as your interlining or structural layer? You can, but you're still going to get a little bit of sag. You won't get as much sag as you would not having any lining at all, any structural element at all. But yeah, if you want a sort of saggy, really comfortable cardigan look, then, but you don't want the seams falling apart and you don't want it to sag too much, I mean, that is an option. I've done it with 1 or 2 of my jackets. I have made about 100 jackets for myself, but personally, I wouldn't recommend it. 1 layer of netting isn't stiff, really. All it does, it's like a fence that holds up. You know how ivy grows over a fence and you can't really see the fence? It's the same with the netting. You can't see it and you can't feel it if there's only 1 layer. I think some people see me making jackets with 2 or 3 layers of stiff netting, and it is a lot. It is a lot. I go to a lot of different stores and I find the stiffest possible netting I can possibly find. You know, the stuff that they make the opera dress corsets out of, the really robust stuff, and I use 2 or 3 layers of that. So I don't recommend that unless you're doing extremely heavy beading, but just in general I would recommend 1 layer of the stiff netting. It just looks visually beautiful. And I mean, if you look at a man's bespoke suit, there is so much horsehair in that, all this stiff, irky canvas with horsetails glued to it. And when you look at a beautiful suit, you never think about that. It's the same with the stiff netting that I use in these tweed jackets. You can't, I mean, you know it's there because you made it, but I don't think anyone else would know that it has any structural integrity at all. It just looks natural. But the point is, you're doing pre-conservation almost, and you're just preserving that look against, decades of gravity and wear. So it's always going to look beautiful rather than just looking beautiful for the first, 5 days that you wear it and then it's starting to pull at all the seams or anything. So if you are still here, that means you are well and truly sold by now on the idea of your jacket having to have a structural layer. So how do you do it? Well, there are 2 ways to make a jacket with structural lining. You can interline, which basically means you cut out 1 set in the structural layer and 1 set in the tweed, and then you put them together, and you can either hand stitch them together or just pin them together and work with them, the 2 fabrics basically as one. And that's one way to do it. Or you can drape, which is much more frustrating, but particularly if you're pattern matching, it can give you absolutely gorgeous results. So I have a green Chanel style jacket coming up in a few next week. That will be the interlining method. But if you want to watch a video now, then from last year in October, I did an Italian tweed using the interlining method, and it's a gorgeous tweed, but it's a pretty clear video too. Or if you want to see one with the draping method, any of my videos from last month, I think they're all pattern matching ones. The dragonfly jacket, the knit jacket, or the Gucci tweed, and also a couple of the videos that you're just about to see here are also drape ones. Basically, when you're draping, you make the shell, the netting pieces, you sew them together in a shell, and then you drape over the tweed. You sew the 2 layers together, and then once you've sewn all the shell pieces separately, you sew the 3 shell pieces together, and that becomes your bodice, and then you make all the rest of the jackets. Goodness, I think that's it. Oh, I did not expect this video to be this long or this detailed. Sorry about that. I was originally going to do a separate one about the history of Chanel and about the structural layer, but then I was like, I will be forever referring people from one video to the other one. I'll just roll it all into one, and it can be sort of like a podcast that you have in the background. And yeah, I still have to, at this point, I haven't gathered all the images. I've just done I wrote the script and then I recorded it, and now I have to go find and make all the footage and photos. Wish me luck. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this video or just listening to it. I really appreciate it. I hope your December is going well and things aren't too frantic and utter madness. Thanks for watching and happy sewing. Once upon a time, there was an Earth named... No, that is not correct. There was a girl named Planet. There was a planet named Earth and a girl named Chanel. Yes!